Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. It is my tradition that on days when we recite Yizkor, when we remember our loved ones, I use the time allotted for my sermon to remember the life and impact of somebody who I believe we should all remember. It's with great sadness that my search for somebody worthy ended abruptly several weeks ago. It was then I became certain of the subject of today's sermon. Only weeks ago, Mireille Knoll, a Jewish woman, a grandmother, a purveyor of the Shoah, was murdered in her apartment in Paris. She was 85 years old. To say that she was murdered is an understatement. The killer or killers stabbed her 11 times and then burned her body as the police found her apartment set ablaze on Friday, March 23rd, 2018. Authorities suspect, and I believe now have in custody, her Muslim neighbor and an accomplice to the murders. The New York Times published an article on March 28th titled, "Mireille Knoll, Murdered Holocaust Survivor, is Honored in Paris," in which the reporter interviewed Knoll's personal care aide, Leila Desante, who arrived at Knoll's apartment and cared for her every day. In the article, Desante commented, and I quote, "She survived the Holocaust in the last century. I think she had a happy life, and yet she was killed at home in 2018, frail and defenseless." Ms. Desante said, as she was leaving Ms. Knoll's apartment building after laying flowers on the doorstep. And then she asked, and I quote, "What world are we living in?" End of quote. And that's the question of the day. What world are we living in? I could take this sermon in a very grim direction. As I searched article after article, I could discuss the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe today. On March 26th, the Washington Post published an article, "The Brutal Killing of a Holocaust Survivor Raises Anti-Semitism Fears in France." I can assure you that there are no fears. It's a reality. In it, the article points out that regarding Knoll's murder, Jewish advocacy groups were, and now I quote, "quick to put the case within the context of rising anti-Semitism in France, and point out the similarities to another high-profile case being investigated as anti-Semitic, the April 2017 killing of Sarah Halimi, a 66-year-old Orthodox Jewish physician and kindergarten teacher who was beaten in her apartment, then thrown out her window. Authorities suspect her Muslim neighbors." End of quote. What world are we living in? I wouldn't have to do much work to take this sermon to a very dark place and just read the ADL statistics of rising anti-Semitism all around the world. But I'm not going to do that this morning. Instead, I'm going to try to speak about the beauty of Mireille Knoll's life. You see, I had grandparents who all witnessed the horrors of the Shoah in Europe, and I wouldn't want any of them solely defined by that experience alone. I don't believe the killers or anti-Semites at large should be allowed that victory of framing the meaning of the lives of our loved ones that they tear away from us. I refuse to live in that world. I searched through the internet article after article after article, looking for details of her life, only able to find details about her death. Finally, I found an article published by the Washington Post on March 27th titled "Anti-Semitic Slaying of 85-Year-Old Prompts Outcry in France." The article begins to describe Mireille Knoll's life, and I quote, "At age 9, she fled Paris to escape a notorious World War II roundup of Parisian Jews. French police herded some 13,000 people, including more than 4,000 children, into the Val d'Hiv Stadium, I'll butcher all of these words, in 1942, and shipped them to the Auschwitz death camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. Fewer than 100 people survived. A family member with Brazilian citizenship helped Knoll and other relatives escape Nazi-occupied territory for Southern Europe and then Canada. She returned to France after the end of the war. Over the years, her grandchildren and other French Jews moved to Israel, but Knoll stayed in her beloved Paris, living nearly her whole life in the modest apartment on Avenue Philippe Auguste. There was nothing to steal. My mother was poor, her son said. Her credit card, she would have only been able to withdraw 100 euros. She had no money on her account. Authorities have not released the names of the two men in custody, but have said the chief suspect is a 29-year-old with a past conviction who lived in the same building. Daniel Knoll said the suspect had lived there since he was 7 years old. His mother took pleasure in having him at home, and although we'd asked her not to welcome him, she let him in like she always did, the same way she did with everybody, with kindness, her son said. My mother had a thirst for knowledge and meeting new people and talking to them, and that's what killed her. End of quote. By other accounts, Mireille Knoll enjoyed going out to restaurants in Paris and seeing movies. By all accounts, she had incredible energy. She loved life. Toward the end of the Washington Post article, it quotes Knoll's granddaughter, Jessica, who lives in Israel. And I quote, "Knoll's granddaughter, Jessica, lashed out at the attackers who burned all of our memories, burned my entire childhood that I experienced there, photos, albums, and souvenirs. Speaking Tuesday in Herzliya in central Israel, Jessica Knoll stroked a ring her grandmother gave her on her last visit to Paris and remembered her irrepressible energy. She used to run faster than all of us." End of quote. I refuse to live in a world in which we allow survivors, prevailers' lives to be defined by their deaths, especially a brutal death like this. Details of her survival and her old age is all we have left. No mention of her childhood, her loves, how she dedicated herself to raising a family with such strong Jewish values that they made Aliyah and have no fear about speaking out openly against anti-Semitism in France. Mireille Knoll's life and death taught me nothing about the way Jews are treated in Europe. I knew it all before her murder. I'll know it the next time I read a very similar article as well. But I've never sat and reflected on how these stories don't only rob her of her life, but it rips away the type of life that she should be remembered for living. I challenge us, all of us, not to remember the way in which she died, but in fact, try to find out the details of the way in which she lived. What the French President Macron doesn't understand is that the legacy of Mireille Knoll doesn't live on in France. It lives on in Herzliya. It lives on where her family remembers all of the life-affirming lessons she taught, where she's remembered in all of her beauty and splendor and fullness as a person, where she's not remembered as a statistic. I pray that we all learn to remember her that way as well. May the memory of Mireille Knoll be a blessing for her family, for our community, for all of Klal Yisrael, and for the entire world. And let us all say, Amen.